Hello everybody, welcome to EPG Pathshala, the lessons in culture studies continuing. This is Pramod K. Nair of the Department of English, the University of Hyderabad. Today we will be looking at the module lesson on everyday life and culture studies. The problem of everyday life, as we can call it, has never been addressed in traditional theory. Culture studies, with its insistence on looking at routine, mundane, boring activities, has argued a case that the everyday must be the subject of analysis, must be the object of observation, because within the everyday practices of life, we can see power plays, questions of domination, hegemony, and ideology. Some of these concepts we have already explored in preceding lessons, where we have examined the role that, say, discourse or representation or stereotyping have played in the construction of identities, stereotyping, for instance, or gender and patriarchy. What we will examine today is the necessity of examining the everyday, as to why we theorize the everyday. We think in terms of examining various aspects of everyday life, whether it is the spectacle of everyday life, whether it is the psychogeography of a city, the production and consumption of spaces, the practices in everyday life, and eventually, of course, we will think in terms of the premier domains around which everyday life for most of us is organized: space and time. What do we mean by everyday life? Why do we think the everyday life is worth examining at all? We think of everyday life as routine, but we often do not understand that everyday life is made up of a huge number of possibilities, of choices we make. Should I wait for this bus or that bus? Should I take this route or that route? Is it more congested in this kind of shopping area or in that kind of shopping area? Now you see, these are not ordinary things in that sense, because they determine the way in which we lead our life. But it has not been the subject of analysis because it has been deemed a little too ordinary, too mundane. In technical terms, it's called the quotidian, the routineness of everyday life. Think of how many hours one spends waiting in queues, whether it's at banks, ATMs, movie houses, restaurants. The queue is integral to everyday life. And thinkers like Joe Moran and others have noted that a considerable amount of time in our routine everyday interactions is spent just waiting at bus stops, railway stations, or wherever. We make choices there as well as to whether it's I need to do this, or that's a shorter queue, should I go elsewhere? Those choices are determined by a range of possibilities we keep in our heads, and this becomes part of a regular routine. This is everyday life. It also involves objects and processes. For instance, modes of transport. Now, we don't take it seriously as part of conventional discourse analysis because we think, oh, transport is ordinary. Yes, but you see, regular lives are made up of several such ordinary instances. People like Ben Highmore have noted spaces, waiting, processes like transport, information, communications are integral to the way we define our identity. Critics like Daniel Miller, key thinker in material culture studies, has noted that my identity, as in my individual identity, is linked to the phone I use, the vehicle I patronize every day, the kind of transport I wish to choose. In other words, these choices are not empty abstract concepts. They're integral to the way we fashion our identities. There's another part to this. When I fashion my identity based on the objects I use or the processes I follow, for instance, am I a person who goes out to lunch with colleagues? Or am I a person who spends evenings after working hours with colleagues at a quiet restaurant? The everyday also consists of social interactions. And social interactions, as we have seen before in culture studies, is determined by questions of class, power, economic exchanges, our perceptions of people and things. In India, for instance, the after-work collegiality, the after-work socializing is a comparatively recent phenomenon, which was not so before. And that has to do with a different notion of workplace culture that has come in the last 20 years or so with post-liberalization India. That is, if you think in terms of people working at MNCs and other organizations, practices like team building exercises or a collective team effort at going out for a picnic or a movie is integral to the way the workplace itself is structured. Now you will say, how is this the subject of any serious study? Well, you see, if the workplace is a place of encounters and social relations and power dynamics, those power dynamics are also working out in this process of supposed leisure. Leisure is a cultural category which is built into workplace cultures today, which is why the everyday is transformed into something else. So leisure is also part of workplace culture. Our traditional understanding has been you go to office and work, but your leisure is elsewhere. Now the workplace culture includes leisure. For instance, recreational spaces within offices, corporate buildings and companies is part of everyday life. Likewise, team building exercises, picnics and excursions, educational tours are part of workplace cultures. Now you will quickly recognize that this effectively means your everyday life, where you divided time between work and leisure, has broken down. That distinction doesn't work because it's part of what we do. You will ask, why is this important? It's important, like I said, because the process of demystifying the everyday, the part of unpacking the everyday, also involves unpacking the power relations, choices, self-representation and self-fashioning in the everyday. What do I mean by this? I've already mentioned to you the economic conditions which determine everyday lives in workplaces. Workplaces have hierarchies, seniors, juniors, higher rank, lower ranks, and things like that. How does a team building exercise in an everyday atmosphere work with hierarchy? That's a culture studies question. What is the mechanism by which my job here, my employment here, makes use of the opportunities available to develop myself? As in, how does it help me fashion myself as a quote-unquote good employee or a loyal employee? Please note, loyalty is a big thing for companies these days, and loyalty is built into everyday processes. For instance, if you are not likely to be participating in the team building exercises, your loyalty is called into question. Now you will say, but my loyalty is based on the work I do. No, the work you do and the leisure that you occupy yourself with in the company of your colleagues is part of everyday life. This, you will say, is enforced sociality. Yes, it is. But that's precisely why it's the subject of cultural studies, because so many studies will point out that workplace cultures and their transformations are determined by class, gender, caste and community, race and religion. That's precisely what we are talking about. When we wish to look at these so-called routine things, we are effectively looking at the production of social relations and the reproduction of social relations. So, as a throwaway question, do you think at moments of relaxation or in leisure spaces, the ranks or hierarchies within an organization are broken down? No. Bosses are always bosses, subordinates are always subordinates. Even in so-called team building exercises, the power relations continue to operate. We may use a different lexicon, we may use a different vocabulary, but the boss does not become a subordinate. The boss does not become a clerk. This set of power relations is what we study in culture studies anyway. Our routines in a workplace, as in the kind of time we spend doing routine things, is central to the way we look at conventional representations. For example, the time we spend looking at computer screens, the time we spend in attending meetings. These are representations of workspaces. Cultural studies like Ben Highmore's or Michel de Certeau or Joe Moran's on cultural studies and the everyday have focused on the kind of concepts, discourses that determine our routine interactions. New cultures of workplaces will, like I said, ask for leisure as part of what we routinely do, but they also involve self-representations and a certain politics of everyday life. Aesthetics is part of it. Think in terms of the interior decor of offices now and the open plan system. as opposed to the cubicles, which, if some of you might remember, was a characteristic of government offices till the late 80s and early 90s. The open plan cubicle system is part of now work culture. It was not part of the traditional architecture of a workplace. Clothing and dress codes are also now rigorously maintained. This is the aesthetics of everyday life. The aesthetics of everyday life involves small, apparently trivial things like architectural plans, decor in offices, whether it is the plants that are strategically placed in offices, the CCTVs which are part of everyday life, the kind of costume or clothing that you're supposed to wear, speech patterns are part of everyday life. This is what is traditionally thought of as routine and ordinary, but which in culture studies assumes a certain poetics, a certain politics. Poetics because it has narrative, it has discourses, it has representation. Politics because, like I have already mentioned to you, it involves questions of power. Now, having looked at this, we need to return to a concept we have briefly touched upon in earlier lessons. Culture is ordinary. What do we mean by this? When we say culture is ordinary, it means we have to make a distinction between the culture most of us share, as in mass or popular culture, and the so-called elite culture, which is at a different level, different plane. So for instance, high-end art galleries are elite cultures. The street play is mass culture. The ordinary bunch of people who go and watch popular masala films is mass culture. The multiplex niche cinema, art house cinema, is elite culture. Classical concerts versus popular rock bands at Hard Rock Cafe. Those are the distinctions we need to think in terms of when we are looking at culture studies. Now, why is it that we have to pay attention to culture is ordinary? For the simple reason that most of us fall into the category of mass culture. And because mass culture also involves a politics. So when we say culture is ordinary, it can be the ordinariness of our workplace. It can be the ordinariness of our school, college systems. It can be part of our social interactions. But the reason why culture is ordinary is because it is the lived experience of a large mass of people. It involves negotiating between queues, waiting for television channels, watching routine thrillers, whatever it might be. When we say culture is ordinary, it is a culture we all share, whether it is popular music, walking to work, bicycling, the clothing we wear, the leisure activities we perform and undertake over weekends. Culture is ordinary because it involves economics, self-representation, ideological and hegemonic structures. In traditional cultural studies, these are subject to ethnographic analysis. Why ethnographic analysis? Because every community, whether it's workplace communities like universities or MNCs or NGOs, they have a specific set of norms. How we behave, how we talk, how we interact with each other, the kind of language we have. Ethnography is the study of particular communities and their ritual practices, their customs of interaction. In other words, since culture studies is interested in everyday life, we study ethnographies of everyday life, which can include people waiting in a bus queue. People have undertaken such studies to examine how and why people wait in bus queues. Is there a mode of social interaction? For instance, do we look at each other when we are sitting opposite each other in a bus or a local train? What is the kind of community that is built around local trains in Bombay? There are studies done of these ones. In a bit we will look at loitering and the gendered use of space as well. But it's important to understand why this is a key part of what we do. Now, when we think in terms of everyday spaces, everyday life, in the late 20th century, practically all of everyday life is mediated through some kind of electronic medium. This could be in the form of images that come to you. It could be in the form of the communications network that you occupy, the roles, the instant messaging, the kind of profile uploading that we do, the sharing of pictures and things like that. We convert the everyday into a spectacle. In a very influential book, Guy Debord called it the society of spectacle, and this is something that has been built up over the last decade or so. What does this mean? It means very simply, in contemporary times, with the use of something like, say, Instagram or instant messaging or any of the social media networks that we have come to occupy, we fashion ourselves to be consumed in the form of a screenshot, a video. We document our everyday life as though it's worthy of a museum, as though it's worthy of a spectacle. In other words, we live online on screen. We consume others online on screen. There is no way now in the 21st century that we can see ourselves as leading a life away from our social media presence. We cannot think in terms of our self-representation without, say, our profile pictures, the chat rooms we occupy, the kind of Instagram, Picasa, Flickr images we consume and we share, the kind of updating we do on Facebook. Why is this important? It's important because if cultural studies is interested in the lived experience of everyday life, mediated spectacles are part of the lived experience now. It is no longer a separate, unique situation where you go and spend some time exclusively for media purposes. Media is what we live in. It's immersed in us like we are immersed in it. You will say that sounds a little awkward. It might sound to psychoanalytic critics as a distinct version of narcissism, but it's not quite the case. It's not quite the case because an entire cultural phenomenon has grown up around social media, around the society of the spectacle. We share spectacles. We are part of the spectacle. The spectacle is a form of social interaction. Now, why is the question of spectacle important at all? It's important because there is, via the media, a mapping of urban spaces, lived spaces, workplaces and leisure spaces. This brings us to the other crucial point, the production of space. At first glance, the title, which comes from a very influential book by Henry Lefebvre called The Production of Space, might seem an odd one. Space is not produced, is it? Space is produced. How so? Take a routine example. Several of you sit in classrooms. The teacher comes in, stands at one end, you sit on this side. Teacher lectures, you listen, you write your notes, teacher goes away, you go away. Suppose on a particular day, the teacher comes in here and says, we are going to play football in the classroom. And the students are all told, push your benches away and come to the center and play. Some of you might wonder, but this is hardly the place to play football. Now you see, when is that room a classroom? That room is a classroom when a teacher teaches and a student or a bunch of students sit down and write their notes. When there's a football in the middle and the students and teachers are playing football, that's not a classroom anymore. What I'm trying to get you to see is the space as a classroom is produced by the activities that are performed there. The space is produced by the social relations in that particular physical place. Space is produced through social interactions. Henry Lefebvre's major insight was space is a social construction. And what he was referring to was what he called real spatial practices, as opposed to abstract place. Abstract place is, outer space is an abstraction in our heads. Have you wondered whether when you leave the school at the end of a day or when you leave your college at the end of a day, what happens to the classrooms? Are there classrooms any longer? A classroom is a classroom only when there is a teaching activity or teaching and learning activity going on there. In other words, it is the performance of a teacher and a bunch of students that produces that space. Likewise, a bus shelter. Remember, we have spoken about waiting for a bus. When is a bus shelter produced? When people wait for a bus. When the bus services terminate at, say, midnight and there is nobody waiting, what is a bus shelter? A bus shelter is only a place. A place becomes space. A place becomes space when people come together, enact a ritual. Remember what I told you, the ethnography of practices. What time is the next bus? Oh, the next bus is in 10 minutes. So we all wait because there's a bus in 10 minutes. Everybody comes together. At 12:30 in the night, somebody comes and says, when's the next bus? Oh, there's no bus here. Oh, there's no point in waiting. Goes away. It's no longer a bus shelter. What I'm trying to get you to see is the production of space of the bus shelter is only possible when people agree. We will all come here, wait, there will be a bus arriving, and we will go. That is, there is an instrumental use of place which produces space. It's a system of social relations that produces space. It's a system of power relations, hierarchies, economic and cultural exchanges that produces space. Why is this important at all? As in, why should we study space? We should study space because the real spatial practices is a reflection of social relations, market relations. Some of you, if you are reading newspapers, will have noted news items which says several Indian cities are unfriendly to pedestrians. What does that tell you? It means very simply, we are increasingly an automobile culture. We are no longer a pedestrian culture. There are no pavements. People walk in the middle of the road, they get run over, they get hit. What are we talking about here? You see, the so-called public space has been more or less now defined as space for automobiles, not a space for walking. Think of a very traditional system of the utilization of public space in India, the tent for marriages or any functions. Anybody has a function in their house, they pitch a tent on the road. Now you cannot actually do that because that road is meant for others as well, but you have converted it into part of your house. The performance of the ritual is inside your house, but you have taken the outside into your house by constructing a little tent, pitching a little tent and converting it into a space where people will come and eat or stand around or whatever. Now surely that public space is the right space for everybody else, which has been denied to them because you have made it into something else. These are spatial practices. When people convert that space into privatized space, what we call in India encroachments, you have redefined that space. These are very crucial practices. You see, space is not automatic. When all available space is taken up by, say, automobiles, it's no longer a space for people to walk. It's no longer a space for people to relax, wander, just hang around, because you cannot stand around there without being hit by something. So you will not stand around. There are in several cities in India a pedestrianization project underway. Hong Kong is going in for pedestrianization in a big way because they have said there's no space for people to walk. These are spatial practices. But if you think a little more carefully and you have paid some attention to cultural studies lessons, these are exercises of power. When the municipal corporation or the urban development authority says no pedestrians, they've exercised the power of the automobile user and not the power of the pedestrian. You will discover that in several cities there are barricades and barriers which prevent people from crossing. There are between the two sides of the road huge structures that prevent people from crossing. You have to use a foot over bridge. The simple question is, do senior citizens find it easy to use a foot over bridge? The answer is no. People carrying luggage, can they cross? No. Those are power relations. And if you recall what I said at the beginning of today's lesson, these are also relations within society. When you privilege the automobile user, you automatically deprivilege the pedestrian, the senior citizen, the infirm, those who are differently abled, who cannot take stairs to climb over. How does the person with a crutch cross a road in India? The person with a crutch cannot cross the road in India. It's as simple as that. Now, you will think this is not really worthy of attention. It is. It is worthy of attention because it doesn't matter to you or me, but it matters to the person who is using a crutch. These are social relations. In other words, like I said at the beginning of this section on the production of space, space is a reflection of social relations. When we say the pedestrian cannot walk here and must walk only there, there are no longer open spaces. When was the last time you saw an open playground for children in today's cities? You're denying them the space to play. Even schools and colleges do not have playgrounds. These are social relations again, and those are determined by questions of economy, questions of ethnographic practices of specific communities. For instance, gated communities have walkways inside the communities for the older citizens to walk and spaces for children to play. Those are the ethnographic practices of that particular community. This production of space is very important because it determines practically all our lives. Where we wait, where we eat, where we sit down, where we rest, where we undertake leisure, these are part of everyday lives. We have never paid attention to them before. You see, if you think of expressways in cities, you can't walk on them. Why? Because they are not meant to be walked on. Now, in our everyday life, suddenly you discover that several routes that you used to take to your workplace are cut off, are no longer accessible to you. That is a production of space of a certain kind. Bus shelters, pavements that are uneven so you can't walk on them, bus shelters with seating arrangements where you can't sit because they are rough and crude, preventing people from sitting. The ostensible answer that was given in Los Angeles based on a particular experiment is something I'll come to in a minute. You see, in Los Angeles they were worried that there were vagabonds and drunken people who were using the bus shelters to sleep. They were spending time, endless hours of time there. So they constructed seats which were curved this way. So you couldn't sit on it. You couldn't sleep on them, curved seats. You could only perch for a brief while. They are interdictory spaces. Now you'll say, how is this important? You see, the minute you create a situation where a bus shelter is constructed like that, it dissuades people from using them. You have automatically demarcated the legitimate user of that space and the illegitimate user of space. That's power relations, isn't it? If you recall our earlier work on this kind of structures of society, who is acceptable, who is not, is a system of power relations. Eligibility criteria are power relations. This is everyday life. This is ethnographic study of the organization of space and the organization of time. Now, since we have talked about the production of space, let's spend some amount of time talking about the production of time as well. Our working hours are 10 to 5 traditionally, or 9 to 4 or whatever it might be, but roughly about an 8-hour work day, for which you are compensated in monetary terms for some amount of time. Now, how does this zone of time called work time get transformed? Some of you have heard of things like work from home. Home is not a place where you work, right? Home is a place where you relax, you rest, you are with your family. But what is work from home suggesting? Work from home suggests there is no distinction between office and home. Second, when people take work home, as in several companies will give their employees laptops and communication devices so that they can stay online. This means effectively you take your work from workplace to home place. You take it on your holiday, you take it when you travel. Several of you might have seen people working while they are traveling by train or by air. Effectively, you are talking of 24-hour mobile offices. That's the production of time. Because when you thought, oh, I only work from 9 to 5, you no longer work 9 to 5. You no longer work in an office. Your office is something that extends into your leisure space. It extends into your home space. And there is no longer a clear-cut distinction between work and home. You will see people sitting at bus stops working. You will see people traveling and working. You will see people on the phone conducting professional work-related conversation when they are driving. All of those are the transformation of space, the breakdown of barriers between work and home. It's the transformation of time as work time and home time. 70%, according to statistics, of people who work in MNCs take work home. They carry work home. They work from home. So you really can't say any longer that there is work time and there is home time. Having looked at both of this, let's talk briefly about the kind of politics of spaces of a different kind. When you think in terms of the organization of spaces, we have markets, connectives, as in spaces of connection, roads. There are heritage spots and museums. There are cathedrals, temples, which you go and visit occasionally. But there are also spaces where you just stand around doing nothing. You just hang around, doing nothing, you relax. This apparently is a routine phenomenon, right? No, it's not a routine phenomenon. It's a routine phenomenon which is gendered. The question that you have to ask is, when we loiter, do you see women and girls loitering? People like Shilpa Phadke from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Bombay, have done detailed studies of this. Do women loiter? As in, they are looking at the organization of urban space where two things happen. The men just linger and loiter. The women always have somewhere to go. As in, the women's movement, the traversal of space, is always with a purpose, with an intent. Loitering is considered not quite feminine, not quite safe for the woman. The question you have to ask is not whether the woman should or shouldn't. The question is, does the kind of urban space we have in India allow and enable the woman to loiter? How does it become gendered? What is the safety issue involved in lingering? A mall is a relatively safe space for women to loiter. But can you say the same about streets? Moving on from gender to questions of class. When you go to malls, do you often see very badly, poorly dressed people? Your cab drivers? No, they wait outside. Why? There is a built-in but invisible social barrier in the usage of space. People of a certain class, people who dress in certain ways, people with a certain amount of liquid money enter that space. Not everyone. So there is, like I said, the gendering of public space where women don't loiter. There is a classing of public space where certain classes of people don't enter. They are welcome to wait outside. They are welcome to pass through. You are not encouraged to loiter, linger, just hang around. Because the space of the mall is for potential shoppers. For people who look at the spectacle in the shop window and are likely to buy. The cab driver can't afford to buy those. The auto rickshaw driver cannot afford those. He is not a potential customer. In other words, what we are looking at is the conversion of public space into the space of consumption, which is also part of the production of space. If the women don't loiter, then a certain class of people don't loiter. If you look at what I have just said about the gendering and classing of public space, we are actually talking about a critique of everyday life, where everyday life is organized around class, identities, which could be about religion, caste, community, race, and things like that. Some of you might know that in the early part of the 20th century, the big clubs, we still have those clubs like the Gymkhana Club and the older cantonment clubs around the country, used to have a notice, Indians and dogs not allowed. The British used to put up notice saying, Indians and dogs not allowed. It was not a public space for the Indians, as in, there were very clear ways of distinguishing between who was a legitimate user and who was not. We may no longer have those signs, but there are built-in but invisible, like I said, conditions in which space is produced in certain ways. When we make observations like that, we are producing a critique of everyday life. In the critique of everyday life for cultural studies, what is important is that we understand that there are ideologies of consumption, ideologies of identity that determine how space is produced. For instance, that women don't loiter is not that the women don't want to loiter, but that space discourages women from loitering. That's a question of social relations. So why don't women loiter? The general answer is, because women have a purpose. No, that's not quite true. Women may want to loiter, but the way the public spaces are structured, the way the social organization of time and space is performed, the women are not encouraged or don't feel safe enough to loiter. Our urban spaces are not necessarily friendly towards people of certain communities, castes, class, and genders. A critique of everyday life looks at questions of space, looks at questions of time and questions of consumption as reiterating, reinforcing class distinctions. And there are ways in which, of course, these distinctions are subverted. Michel de Certeau will speak of strategies and tactics, manipulation of space by people who, like college students, who are sometimes seen in spaces where they ought not to be, but they enter into it, modify it a little bit, work, play, and run away. If you have been looking at things like flash mobs, they are a way of reorganizing that public space. Flash mobs, as you know, are temporary phenomena. They are not permanent structures. Graffiti, as in writings on the wall, are also ways of reorganizing space, the assertion of the right to that space. This is important because for people like Anne Travers, who have written extensive studies of the feminist use of space, Shilpa Phadke from TIS, whom I mentioned before, they are looking at the everyday experience, the lived experience of certain segments of society in places like this. The village, the rural person who comes to the city, the lower class, economically disempowered cab driver who enters the mall, the non-English speaking person who enters a mall or an IMAX where all the signs are in English. What does that person do? Think of this problem. If you don't read and write English and you enter a mall where all the instructions, starting with the arrangement, which floor contains what, they are in English. How do you know which floor contains what if you don't know the language? Think of airport signs. Automatically the airport and the mall are directing the space, producing the space so that only people who understand English can use them. How come in all our cities these signposts are not in multiple languages? We have never thought about it. That's also the construction of everyday life, because our shopping might take place there, but then you go there and you say, no, I can't go there because I don't understand. Think of the problem of finding parking. Four layers of parking, levels of parking. You don't know how to do that. These are negotiations. Negotiations of the entry points, the checks via electronic doorways, the kinds of little rituals that we do. In other words, I'm asking you to pay attention to the many rituals that construct our social lives. These are gendered, these are classed, these are raced. Increasingly, when people work on these ones, they're looking at these as processes that construct identities. They divide and bring people together. To summarize, the critique of everyday life notes how spaces are organized, time is organized, and identities are organized. Everyday rituals are integral to this because these everyday rituals are going to structure, reinforce, or subvert existing power relations. These power relations, modified in minor or major ways, are built around questions of identity such as race, class, and gender. When the production of space is accompanied by the production of time, they determine our lived experience of that particular place, which becomes space. Our lived experience is integral to our fashioning of our identities and our social relations. A critique of everyday life, therefore, is integral to cultural studies because they are finally about power and identity. Thank you.